All right, y'all. This is Mountain Tales and River Stories, episode 7. Story 1. Brothers of the Rio. The rat watched the boys on the riverbank. He had seen them before. There were 5 of them, all teenagers, with tackle boxes and fishing poles lined up and leaning against the rusted-out frame of an old car seat that faced the water. Each had a can of pop and was chewing tobacco in the late summer evening at a fishing spot known to the boys as the shithole. The rat was careful to stay out of sight, for he was used to being the target of rocks and curses that would send him scurrying up the bank to the safety of the undergrowth. The shithole was across from the mouth of the Elk on the south bank of the Kanawha River in Charleston, West Virginia. Now the rat knew it well. In fact, the rat's own bloodline went back to colonial times, and the founding of Charleston was embedded deep in the rat family's collective memory. Despite the crude nom de guerre, the shithole was a very historic site. The rat's ancestors had been present when the Shawnee led the captive Mary Ingalls downriver to Kentucky during the French and Indian War. 20 years later, a young Simon Kenton would pass right by the spot where the boys were currently fishing. The Rodents family witnessed the groundbreaking of Clendenin's Fort in 1788, later known as Fort Lee, and the nucleus for the future city. Daniel Boone once lived upriver for a time. The Great Indian Sieges were known to the Rats family as well. The Ranger, Fleming Cobb, and Mad Ann Bailey had both saved Fort Lee by bringing in a fresh supply of powder and lead while being pursued by painted warriors. Cobb paddled to Fort Randolph on the Ohio and back in 14 hours, while Bailey rode on horseback to and from Fort Savannah in the Greenbrier country. Some of the rat's ancestors had been killed by the fort's cat while raiding a supply of parched corn. The rat also lost kin who had ventured up the hill to raid the stores at Fort Scammon, built by Union troops in 1863 to fortify the heights above the river overlooking the shithole. One thing the rat knew, as well as the history of Charleston, was that rats were despised by fishermen, and wisely he chose to return to the safety of his hole in the riverbank. A long rifle shot away from the site of the founding of Fort Lee nearly 200 years earlier, the boys were assembled across the river. All were bait fishing that evening and hoping for a big carp or channel cat. They had known each other since grade school and were able to fish with the easy familiarity only possible with close friends who were almost like family. Though not overly macho like most teenagers, they preyed on weakness. They never overlooked a chance to joke with or berate each other about everything from girls to setting a hook in a rotten log or snagging a line in a tree limb while casting. That evening, they had a metal bucket half filled with sand and kerosene. They had lit it up, and it was serving as a makeshift smudge pot, the black smoke wafting across the gritty riverbank as the wind dictated. With a sweating open tub of chicken livers on the sand by their feet and a cup of night crawlers resting on a flat rock, the boys had soiled their hands for the evening by baiting their hooks. The fronts of their t-shirts were stained from wiping the excess bait slime from their hands. They closely watched their rod tips for a strike. Occasionally, one of the rods would give a quick jerk followed by a slackening of the line. Other times, the jerk would be followed by a spastic shaking of the rod. In either case, the owner of the rod would fetch it from the old car seat, set the hook, and reel like hell. More often than not, the result was a good-sized carp or channel catfish. When a carp was brought in, some of the boys would hold it up by the gills and spit a foot-long dark stream of tobacco juice into the fish's mouth before returning it into the river. These boys were fairly ethical in their treatment of fish they caught. They would never intentionally hurt a fish, though they had witnessed some atrocities in their years at the shithole. They had seen carp mutilated and their guts used for bait that brought in huge catfish that were in turn taken home and eaten. At the time, the boys who witnessed this agreed that they were not hungry enough to fish in such a manner. Once a stranger was fishing down the bank and caught a large gar, which he threw back, only after jamming the fish's snout into a plastic bottle. The boys saw the bottle bob away with the poor gar swimming behind it in the current. The presence of such shady, unethical characters was simply a reality when fishing in the evening, especially at night. There is always an element of danger along any river. The boys, however, felt safe since they always fished as a group, and should such a person invade their fishing spot, they would just play it safe and placate the interloper until it was time to move on. They heard the dry sound of boots sliding on gravel, the sound of someone coming down the hill from McCorkle Avenue. The boys turned their heads and saw a man they had seen before. He was a thin, white-haired man of about 60 years of age. He always carried an ultralight rod and spinning reel. He was a dedicated angler and never fished with bait. The boys had seen him bring in little strippers on small, brightly colored spinners. They knew he was retired, and he went by the nickname Ski, an abbreviated version of his long Slavic name most found too difficult to pronounce. The boys considered him a wise old man, worthy of respect, and an all-around straight shooter. "Howdy, boys. Catch anything?" "Nothing yet, just a few hits," was the reply. Ski set up his rig and cast his line, slowly reeling in the spinner. "Well, I've seen a river once that was plumb full of fish, and you couldn't catch a one. Where at?" "In the Philippines. We could see all the fish in that river, and we couldn't get one to bite. So we threw in a few hand grenades, and that did the trick." "Hey, Ski, what was that you were telling us that time about the coconut moonshine?" "Oh, this fella rigged up a still out near the beach where there were a lot of coconuts, and he started making moonshine. Well, that was the rawest stuff you ever tasted. It just took a thimbleful, and you could feel it down to your toes. Anyway, one of the Marines wanted to try it, and we gave him a little shot. And he said he wanted a big drink because he was from Texas. Well, he took a big Texas-sized drink, and a few minutes later he was laying out on the beach right there in the sun, knocked his ass out." The boys loved the old man's stories and knew them all by heart. "What about the Harley?" "Oh, you mean the time we found that Harley Davidson with a sidecar? It was in a crate, and a buddy and I fixed it up. We took that thing out one time with me in the sidecar. I had a BAR, you know what that is." The boys nodded. "Well, we went down this road. Well, it was barely a road, and come around the bend, and the road was just full of Japs. He gunned that thing, and I let go with that BAR, and we just plowed right through 'em, turned around and gunned it right back." As Ski tilted his head back so he could see better through his glasses while reeling in a small striped bass, a siren from across the river caught his attention. They could see a thin man in an orange jumpsuit running across the Elk River Bridge perpendicular to where they were standing. "Must be a prison break," Ski said. "Must have broke out of the county lockup." "If I had that Jap rifle I brought back, I could nail that sumbitch right here." They strained their eyes to watch as the runner made it another 100 yards and faded from view before two squad cars with flashing blue lights zoomed over the bridge for a reunion which reacquainted him with the tender mercies of the justice system. What the hell's going on over there? The boys turned to see a stranger who had arrived unnoticed while their attention was focused on the prison break. "Some guy just broke out of jail and the cops just got him," one replied. The man was wearing a sleeveless t-shirt and appeared to be in his late 30s. In one hand, he held a rod and reel, pre-rigged for bottom fishing, and a small cup of night crawlers. He clutched a six-pack of beer in the other hand. He had no tackle box. On his arms were several ill-defined scrawlings in blue ink that most likely denoted earmarks of his past social life. He talked and lit a cigarette at the same time. The words and smoke came out of his mouth simultaneously. "You boys catching anything?" "Got some hits." He caught a couple of stripers. "I want to get me a damn catfish." Setting his rod against a rock, he opened a can of beer, drank half of it down, and intended to bait his hook. When the time came to select a night crawler and penetrate the black soil in which the worms were sold with his fingers, he hesitated. Turning to the closest boy, he said, "Hey, buddy, would you put that worm on that hook for me? I hate handling them slimy son of bitches." The teenager complied and helped the man out. They watched as he appeared to be able to cast reel, talk, drink, and smoke all at the same time. He did it all at once without appearing to be in any particular hurry. His slow cadence fit the pace and mood of the shithole, and he assumed his place among the brotherhood of shithole fishermen. Ski spoke to no one in particular as he cast and reeled. "Our anniversary's coming up next week. I've got to get my wife something special." "Well, I'm on my third wife, and she's a bitch," the beer drinker replied. "We've been married 40 years, and I'll tell you, sometimes I had to go out of town for weeks at a time for work, and when I got home, it was a honeymoon every time." "And God bless you, sir," said the beer drinker, raising his can. "You just got to work it out and keep at it. It takes a lifetime to make a marriage work." Just then the beer drinker's rod went off. The tip gyrated down and back up, pulling the top half of the rod into an arc that pointed to the river. Throwing aside the beer can, he grabbed the rod, set the hook, and began to reel. About 20 yards out, a huge white mass rolled on the surface. "That's a big damn carp," one of the boys cried out as they quickly reeled in their lines to avoid getting tangled with the carp. They set their rods aside and stood slightly behind him, the best vantage point to watch the action. The carp was a fighter and took out some drag. The beer drinker continued to pull back the rod and pump the reel. Then something happened that the boys had never seen before. Just as the beer drinker pulled the rod up nearly vertical with the tip bending forward, the rod came near enough to his face that the tip of his cigarette burned through the monofilament fishing line. The snap of the line was audible, not unlike someone stepping on a dry twig in the woods. The man fell backwards and was caught by two of the boys who had been watching. The line went slack and the carp was gone. A broken line was nothing new. It happened all the time. But they had never seen someone burn their own line with a cigarette before. They had seen it happen once with a Coleman lantern while night fishing, but that was different. A fish was not on the line. The man righted himself, threw down his rod in disgust, and let fly a stream of expletives that befitted the situation. After he calmed down with 2 more beers and a cigarette, the boys gave the beer drinker a hook and a sinker so he could fish again. They even baited his hook for him, but not entirely for charitable reasons. One of the boys casually asked, "Got an extra beer, buddy?" The beer drinker didn't even turn his head. His eyes focused on the water. He answered, "There ain't no such thing as an extra beer, buddy." The other boys laughed and filed the quick reply away for future use against would-be moochers. Shithole wisdom was always appreciated. Over the course of the next hour, the beer drinker caught his sought-after catfish, a good-sized channel cat. The boys ringed him round and held a flashlight as he removed the hook with a multi-tool from his belt. His aversion to night crawlers forgotten, he rebaited the hook and cast into the dark river. The catfish put him in a more jovial mood, and he began to explain his pedigree regarding catching catfish. I used to fish the old Lock 6 in South Charleston with my brother-in-law. Well, he was my second wife's brother, not the brother-in-law I got now. Anyway, we only fished for citation-sized flatheads. They gotta be at least about 30 pounds or so before you get a citation from the DNR. Anyway, we had a hell of a rig for catching flatheads. You ever get a flathead? They're green, slimy, snot-colored bastards. I caught one once on chicken skin, said a voice from the dark riverbank. Chicken hide? I reckon you can get a small one on that kind of bait. We always used bluegills or small drums. We had a generator and we hooked up a big stand of fluorescent lights to fish by. We always took my nephew along. He was just a kid, and he caught the bait for us. Whatever he reeled in, we hooked up and cast it right back out, a quivering on the hook. I used a big old ocean rod with a bait caster reel, like in Jaws. Did you ever get any big ones? Yep, we got a whole bunch of them. Had a Polaroid camera and we got a picture of every one. I'd love to have that photo book, but my ex-brother-in-law's got it somewhere. We'd fish all night, sort of like coon hunting, only on the river. Yeah, I guess it was. We always had a fifth of whiskey and a 357, so we had all the angles covered. Nobody messed with us. The boys reeled in a few drum and small carp. During a lull in the action, one of them built a small fire using driftwood and garbage, for they planned on fishing on through the night. Waves began to roll in as a line of coal barges pushed by a tugboat slowly passed downriver. The lights of Charleston shone and reflected in long moving streams of color on the nighttime water. The beer drinker finished his beer and bid the fisherman good night, heading on home presumably to his third wife. Ski packed up and went home to his first wife. The boys baited another hook, not knowing yet what it was like to have a wife. The boys fished on and threw rocks at a rat they suddenly noticed sniffing the chicken livers, ignorant of the fact that in a few short years high school would end and their lives would change forever. Driftwood and garbage bonfires and all-night fishing marathons down at the shithole would soon become cherished memories, and their lives would move on as sure as the current of the Great Kanawha. Now that's story 1, y'all. All right, story number 2, you guys. Roller Girls at the Empty Glass. Now, the Capitol building of the state of West Virginia is among one of the nation's finest. Designed by famed architect Cass Gilbert along French Baroque and classical Romanesque lines, it was constructed in the depths of the Great Depression, during a time when a traditionally poor state was made even poorer by the harsh economic downturn that spiraled out of control following the crash of '29. It is perhaps a small miracle that such a grandiose structure was even considered by the state's leaders. While so many unemployed young men earned $1 a day building rustic cabins and stone walls under the direction of the Civilian Conservation Corps in one of over 50 CCC camps throughout the mountain state, other construction crews and craftsmen were adding the finishing touches to what would become a picturesque model of democratic government. Fine cut stone, adorned with regal Corinthian columns, supported an iconic cornice and pediment as pleasing to the eye as any true classical structure overseas. A majestic chandelier in the spacious rotunda of shining marble, highlighted with the finest cut glass crystals, loomed over the thousands of tourists who visited the building each year. Footsteps and voices echoed throughout the shining marble halls that reflected the images of whoever passed through the timeless corridors. It is rare to see someone walking quickly through this building, for their eyes are often transfixed on the beauty of the design and with the fine old world craftsmanship. The towering gold-leafed dome and spire, topped with a golden eagle, whose wings often catch the blaze of the sun, is the crowning touch to an architectural masterpiece. If the Capitol building houses the seat of government and the state's power platform, just blocks away downriver exists another sort of Capitol, On the corner of Washington and Elizabeth Streets exists the capital of West Virginia's artistic bohemian underground. Though not gilded with gold foil and marble, this building serves just as important a purpose to the city of Charleston and the state of West Virginia. Some would argue that this building serves a nobler purpose than the one served in the Capitol building, for in this building any money that might be wasted or time consumed or people screwed is never at the expense of the taxpayer. The empty glass is a true Charleston landmark. If yuppies and hipsters flock to microbreweries and guitar bars to drink and listen to music, the glass is where the musicians gather to drink and listen to music. It is the equivalent of an old coastal village that still has a true fisherman's wharf, where all of the real old salts dock their boats and congregate after a day at sea, isolating themselves from the tourists and wannabe sailors. After a gig, songwriters, guitar players, and full bands from venues all over the city can be seen lounging at a table with pitchers of beer or sitting at the bar hunched over a tall boy of PBR. Live entertainment of some sort is offered every night of the week. In the days before the county ordinance banned smoking in bars and restaurants, the glass was a dark, hazy den of smoky funk. Today, the air is clearer, but the message is the same. To cross its threshold is to enter into a cultural mosaic of ever-shifting patterns of light and dark, good and bad, soft and loud, genteel and wild, docile and crazy, all rolled into one big fat joint that could not be smoked in one sitting, but must be passed around the room and shared in common experience. It is a lava lamp of righteous living art and music that exists in the dark recesses of the artist's soul, a psychedelic kaleidoscope of people and music that blend together to form something greater than their individual parts. It is a Jackson Pollock work, painted in smoke, beer, blues, jazz, patchouli, oil, lilac vegetal, ringing amplifiers, tattoos, nose rings, dreadlocks, electric violins, banjos, Hammond organs, leather sandals, spiraling dancing hippie chicks, redneck shit kickers, and steel guitars. It is a lighthouse beacon that calls out to the soul of the artist after the sun goes down, when the muses whisper and beckon like sirens to a rocky shore. Over the years, the glass has become a popular gathering place not only for musicians, but also for people who feel a connection with the art and music community. The bar has been used for a wide range of special events, including fundraisers and even wedding receptions. Any individual or organization with a good cause knows that they can always find a generous, sympathetic reception at the glass. Thus, it was on one hot, sticky Saturday night in the dog days of a recent summer that the local roller girls chose the empty glass as the location for one of their famed after parties. Flat track roller derby had come to Charleston with the new millennium, adding a new nuance to the culture of the Kanawha Valley, as well as an opportunity for courageous women to experience the ultimate in female empowerment. What vocation other than roller derby enables women who work all week the chance to take out their angst and aggression not on the world, but on other women on a weekly basis? They are a sisterhood of stomp whose main goal is to get out on the track and hit a bitch. Broken bones, chipped teeth, bruises, stitches, and concussions are considered rites of passage. Their raw female beauty is often augmented and balanced by scars and patches of purple flesh. Needless to say, the roller girls play hard. They also party hard, and the glass is the perfect launching pad for their party rocket ship. To the roller derby novice, the sport takes some time to fully understand. In a nutshell, there are two teams which face off in what is called a bout. They score points by completing revolutions around a circular track and passing the players on the opposing team. It's sort of like NASCAR, only instead of smoking engines and hot rods zooming around the big ring, it's smoking hot bods zooming around in a ring, more like ASCAR. The chassis The chassis on these vehicles are tightly covered in hot pants and pleasantly gyrate as thighs are pumped and wheels skid into tight turns, sometimes ending in a sudden stop caused by a well-placed booty block or a violent hip check. The after party is a derby tradition hosted by the home team. Some after parties are family-friendly affairs held in the back rooms of nice little restaurants with children running around. These parties are generally quiet gatherings with less drinking, more spiritual bonding and licking of wounds, and appeal more to the motherly side of the roller girls. The glass after parties do not fit into this category. Babysitters are contacted weeks ahead of time when a glass party is on the calendar. All of the attitude, profanity, sweat, body odor, grit, and adrenaline of a bout are transported to the glass and are made manifest in jello shots and leg wrestling. On this night, the girls staggered into the glass in groups, some limping as their carpools arrived. The music thumped into the ears as if the bass amps were wired directly to one's temple. On the stage, the Renfields, out of Morgantown, played their brand of bluesy punk, their outrageous outfits resembling a college Halloween costume party. On the bar, the shots were lined up and slurped down as a dozen elbows jerked up in unison with the snap of heads, and the alcohol began its journey to fortify the bloodstream among screams and shouts that for a brief moment drowned out the music. Uninhibited partiers danced before the stage while the sound man roadblock ensured a good mix at his station behind the large soundboard in the back of the bar. Some couples danced facing each other in what resembled an ancient ritual of courtship. Others slowly shifted with a beer in their hand, lost in their own little world. In a society that increasingly is becoming ever more homogeneous and generic, roller girls are independent, one-of-a-kind nonconformists who blaze their own trails. This is evidenced by each girl's derby name, emblazoned on the back of their jerseys. Many are parodies of popular horror movie characters or action figures. Some intimate a slow death for their opponents or advertise sexual prowess. Though the bout was over and the drinking started, the competition was not over for the night. Another after-party tradition was in full swing for all to see on the dirty floor before the bar. The crowd formed a ragged ring, their heads tilted to the floor, each with an iPhone in hand snapping digital images as two half-drunk derby girls engaged in battle. Gunsy No Pants and Chieftain McManus, their right legs entangled below the knee, immodestly rolled around on the floor in a leg wrestling competition. Gunsy was called No Pants because she was never seen at a roller event wearing pants. She was always in panties and fishnets. She practiced in panties, bouted in panties, and partied in panties. The chieftain was the team captain and dressed with a Scottish theme that paid homage to her Scotch-Irish heritage, common in West Virginia. She had the Scottish flag on the seat of her hot pants and often wore a derby-styled kilt. She led her clan with all of the vehemence and wrath of a modern-day Boudica, the Celtic warrior chieftain of antiquity who fought the Romans. Her fiery red hair and green eyes reflected her Highland temperament on the flat track, as well as on the floor of the glass. In the soft light and shadows of the bar, she resembled a fuller-figured Louise Brooks, the ivory-skinned goddess of the silent screen. The roller girls grunted and screamed as they slammed each other around the floor, their strong muscles contracting. On each of their arms was a large number written in grease pencil to help identify them during the blur and heat of the bout. Each girl's arms were a smear of sweaty black grease as the numbers began to rub off on the floor and onto each other. Finally, Chieftain hauled off and whipped her badass roller thighs into gear and slammed Gunsy around, pinning her to the floor to gain victory. Eager hands reached down from the crowd to help each girl up and maybe get a sweaty, busty hug in return. The two teammates hugged each other in solidarity, drank down a shot that mysteriously appeared in their hands, and slapped each other on the rump for good luck before parting to find their bows. A roller girl walked over to the bar and, tightly cupping them in both hands, rubbed her substantial bosoms against the back of her man's neck as he sat drinking a beer looking up at the TV. The line in front of the restrooms continued to grow as word got out that the roller girl had passed out in the john. The smokers were congregated out in the alley along with non-smokers who wanted a brief rest from the loud music. Leg wrestling and dancing continued. The Derby girls screamed for another round of communal shots from the bar. All the while, the Renfields continued to provide a soundtrack for the surreal scene of earthy beauty that is a roller derby after party. Across town, the Golden Eagle, sitting on his perch atop the state capitol building, watched in silence the wonderful parade of characters who entered and exited the empty glass. Though proud of his station in life and what he represented to so many civic-minded citizens, there were times that he wished he was not so high and mighty and could oversee the city's other capitol building. That's story 2, y'all. All right, y'all, this is story 3, Between Mountain and River. It's called The Candle Shoot. All right, now Dan Potter could hear the spastic screams of the 17-year locusts emanating from the woods on both sides of the road as he ambled along the narrow Putnam County back road on his way to the spring shoot at Bill's Creek. It was a warm Friday evening in May as he drove the curvy road with the windows down in his pickup truck. The spring shoot was a tradition he had grown up with long before he was old enough to hold a muzzle-loading rifle without help from his father. Now, at 22, he had slowly eased into his father's legacy on the firing line and was well known as a crack shot with a flintlock. Besides monthly shooting matches, the gun club held 2 big weekend shoots as a year over the Memorial and Labor Day holidays. The holiday shoots were like family reunions, and shooters from all over West Virginia, Ohio, and Kentucky camping out in the field beside the range. The camaraderie of the firing line and the ensuing campfire was deep and abiding. It was a chance for lifelong friends to get together to catch up, swap yarns, share hunting stories, and confirm their love of frontier history
Excuse me, there is a message for you.
That revolved around the unique American traditions of the iconic Kentucky long rifle. Taken as a whole, the group was a living history book of frontier lore and West Virginia history. Most of them shot rifles they had built themselves in garages and workshops during countless evenings after work or on Sunday afternoons. They were descendants of pioneers who first broke ground and bore the brunt of the violence and hardship of the frontier, paving the way for the land barons, bankers, industrialists, and fish-bellied politicians who would later leave them disenfranchised, second-class citizens in their own country. Their ancestors marched with Andrew Lewis from the Greenbrier County to Point Pleasant, fought the Shawnee, marched with Stonewall in the Valley Campaign, cut the timber, mined the coal, fought in the mine wars, and always served when their country called. They were highly knowledgeable storytellers, and their conversations could be peppered with references about anything from Chief Cornstalk to Don Chafin to WD-40. They were a cross-section of coal miners, construction workers, heavy equipment operators, truck drivers, steel workers, farmers, and professionals. To a man, they were hard-working, honest, gregarious men who grew up baling hay, splitting wood, working with mules, and driving tractors. They knew how to raise hunting dogs and could build virtually anything they needed from scratch. Many were competent blacksmiths and had forged the very knives that hung from homemade leather sheaths on their belts. These eccentric, one-of-a-kind characters had an encyclopedic knowledge of pre-interstate West Virginia, and all of their stories were laced with references to the old routes and rural pikes on which they had spent most of their lives. Most went by nicknames like Shorty, Windy, Big Ugly, the Admiral, Crick, Jaws, Broken Point, Pappy, and Mule. They arrived in trucks and campers from as far away as Beverly, French Creek, Duck, Vienna, Clarksburg, Smoot, Huntington, Williamson, Ashland, Grayson, and Marietta. Some came along alone or in pairs. Some brought their wives and families. It was a great place for a kid like Dan to grow up in the 70s and 80s. A thin film of wood smoke hung over the field as Dan pulled through the gate into the gravel drive that led to the range. His eyes scanned the ragged line of trucks, campers, tents, and lean-tos for familiar faces. He parked along the tree line, let down the tailgate, got out his cooler, and set it down behind the rear of the truck. He took out a cold beer and walked over to the corner of the field where two trucks he recognized were set up with the tailgates facing each other. A polytarp sun cover set up between them. A small camp table and chairs were under the tarp where two men in their 60s were cooking over a Coleman stove. Shorty and Bill were best buddies and always camped in the same spot. Both had grown up in the lean times of the Great Depression, and that experience was reflected in their values and work ethic. They were true West Virginia mountain men. Shorty worked in the long-distance construction trade and knew every inch of the internal combustion engine. His eyes twinkled when he told a yarn, and he could dance a jig and sing every song from Barbara Allen to the Big Rock Candy Mountains. He was the one to beat in the trap chute, and his jug, choked 10 gauge, never failed to dust the flying clay pigeons. Bill was known as the best rifle shot of his day. He could shoot a flintlock and hit his mark with the rifle held upside down, the butt against his forehead, pulling the trigger with his thumb. He could zero his sights in on the thin blade of a sharp axe and hit the blade, splitting the bullet and breaking two china plates at once, one on each side of the axe. He also was a keen trader and always set up table with a variety of wares to sell. Under his trade table were weathered wooden boxes containing a hodgepodge of antique muzzle-loading supplies and implements. He had old powder horns and flasks, powder measures, gun flints, bullet molds, cap boxes, watch fobs, and brass shotgun shells. Several shot pouches hung from the back of his truck, and he always had a large selection of antique folding knives set out on his table. Whenever young boys would open a knife, he would gently warn them with, "Now be careful, boys. Those knives are so sharp you could shave a mouse while he's sleeping and never wake him." As Shorty put it, Bill could sell you yesterday's bird's nest and ice to the Eskimos. Though they didn't know it, both men were two of Dan's heroes, and he valued every minute he spent with them. As Dan approached the tarp, Bill was lighting a Coleman lantern hung from a hook above the table. Steam rose from the cast iron skillet, resting on the hissing camp stove. Shorty was frying up a mess of hash patties, and droplets of sweat ran from his forehead into the skillet as he worked them over with a small spatula. A quart jar of milky liquid sat beside the stove. Shorty's bear grease, or mountain butter, as he called it. He fried everything in bear grease, and hash was no exception. As he began to move the hash patties from the skillet to a tin plate, one slipped from the spatula and fell into the tall grass. "Well, my great-grandmammy's late Aunt Fanny's old black cat's red rectum. That was the best patty I know it was. I went and dropped it." "Hiya, Shorty." "Hey, Bill." "Howdy, son." Dan shook hands with both men and sat in an empty camp chair. Several paces from the table, a cook fire sputtered under a small brown carcass skewered on a makeshift spit made of green maple limbs. What do you got cooking?" "Rabbit," Shorty replied. I was picking up to come to the chute this afternoon, and I saw this feller out in the yard, and I said, 'Mr. Rabbit, If you stay there long enough, you'll get to go to the muzzleloader chute. I got my 22 with CB caps out of the truck, and darned if he didn't get to come to the chute. I popped him, skinned him, ripped his guts out, and threw him in the cooler. Get your knife and cut you off a piece. Dan took off his pocket knife and cut a thin slice of off of the rabbit's back near the rib cage and sat back down, chewing the tender meat, wiping his hands on his jeans. These locusts sure were making some noise today, Dan said. They started tuning up back home about 6 this morning, Shorty reflected. I reckon the whole woods is plumb full of bug shit. Have some supper. We fixed plenty. We knew you was coming. On the table, besides the hash patties, was a large plate of ramps and fried potatoes, several bright red heirloom tomatoes from the garden, a pinch of peach schnapps, and a half bottle of bourbon. Bill handed Dan a paper plate, and he helped himself to some potatoes, ramps, and a hash patty. They ate their supper, and he finished his beer. A ruddy-faced, salt and pepper-haired man in overalls approached the table. Good evening, gentlemen. What's on the spit? Conrad was an old friend who never met a stranger at the range. Shorty was quick with an answer. It would have been 2 possums, but the van tire scalded one, and the crows got the other. You wouldn't bullshit an old country boy, would you? The question is, would an old country boy bullshit me? Shorty laughed. How are you, Connie? Have a drink. Shorty pulled a sleeve of small styrofoam cups from the back of his truck and lined up 4. He poured 2 fingers of bourbon in each cup and passed them out. Thank you, sir. I believe I will, Conrad replied, raising his cup to the group in chivalrous ceremony. Each man gently swirled the cup around for an instant, raised it to his nose to survey the aroma, and took a sip. Shorty sat back in his chair and lit a smoke. The naughty stump that represented the missing index finger on his right hand made it look like he had his finger shoved up his nose when he put the cigarette to his lips. The hash patties are a bit crunchy tonight. Them locusts come a swarming. Some of 'em flew right in the skillet. He hacked out a short laugh. All we need now is some wild honey, and I reckon we can eat as good as John the Baptist this evening. Say, Dan, where's your dad? I expected him to be here. My cousin's getting married this weekend, and they had to go to the wedding. I probably should have went too, but I got a pretty bad track record at family weddings lately. The last one I went to, I got so drunk I ended up with my beer mug stuck in the cake. Another guy in a tuxedo passed out on the shitter, and another guy put a lit cigar on his pocket. After that, the next time I went to a family gathering, they didn't even call me by my name. I was just Evelyn's boy from the wedding. So I figured it was better for all concerned if I just came out to the chute instead. I'd rather be here anyway. Sounds like you're running with a rough crowd, Shorty chuckled. Dan waved his hand across the table. Like this crowd ain't rough. Well, I'm glad you could grace us with your presence. Well, try not to let you corrupt us. Here, finish up this food. Don't want it to go to waste. Did you bring your banjo? It wouldn't hurt my ears to hear a tune tonight. Yeah, it's in the truck. I'll get her out later. I just wish we had a fiddler. Where's that boy you brought out last time? What played the fiddle? He sure was good. He's playing at the Vandalia gathering down by the Capitol this weekend. He said he'd love to come out, but he's up to his ears in music, and he couldn't make it. Last time, when y'all were playing, he fiddled that Shenandoah. I had teardrops the size of Alka-Seltzers. Oh, he's good. But you can't get him away from that fiddle contest this weekend. It pays good. Good, too, if you place. I don't blame him. All I got to pay him with is a charred rabbit and some fried bugs. Before long, the faces around the table were illuminated by the glowing lantern as the sun set and the locusts hushed their raspy cries. The cool quiet of the evening settled in, and the narrow field along the creek was dotted with the scattered lanterns and campfires that defined the camp. Dan left the lantern light and walked out to the open field. The stars were glowing and infinite. The silence of the night was broken occasionally by muffled voices drifting from the campfires and the lonely call of the phantom whippoorwill. As he gazed into the stars, collecting his thoughts, Dan heard the voice of McCartney, the self-appointed camp crier. Candle shoot at 10 o'clock. Meet at Shorty's. A candle shoot? Dan had never been in a candle shoot before. He had never even shot at a candle before, but he had heard of candle shoots. For some reason, he just associated them with frontier times and not the here and now. Well, why not here and now? He'd give it a shot. He checked his watch. It was 9:45. He'd better get moving. A crowd had gathered around Shorty's camp as the appointed time neared. On the table beneath the lantern, an overturned felt-brimmed hat was filled up with $1 bills as shooters paid the entry fee. $1 to enter, the winner gets half the pot and a canned ham. Shorty held a small canned ham up for all to see, smoke rising from the glowing butt between his fingers. If you've never shot at a candle, you don't want to hit the wick. Shoot right above the flame. The whoosh of air from the bullet blows out the flame. He produced a small oval-shaped leather flask and held it out before him. Anybody need a group tightener? 9 shooters entered the match. Several men walked out to 50 yards and set up 4 large white candles on top of the horizontal 2x4s that formed the top of the backstop. The candles were lit and the men walked off 20 paces and dropped a white rag on the ground. They then walked off 10 more paces and dropped a second white rag to mark the distance. The shooters were told to stand in a line just behind the first rag, 20 paces from the candles for the first shot. Dan had never loaded his rifle in pitch darkness before. He screwed the worm onto the ramrod, swabbed the bore with a cotton patch, and wiped the thin layer of oil out of the pan. All of the contestants pointed their rifles to the ground and burned the oil out of the bore by loading a small charge of powder down the barrel and either snapping a percussion cap or touching off the priming of their flintlocks. Sparks shot out of the gun muzzles as the powder charges were touched off, and the guns were made ready for loading. Dan put in a chew for good luck and waited his turn. The 9 shooters represented almost every era in the history of muzzle-loading rifles. There was a half-stock Vincent-style rifle from southern Ohio with pewter inlay and a cherry stock, several Tennessee poor boy rifles with plain walnut stocks and iron mounting, and a few half-stock Hawkins-style rifles that had served the Rocky Mountain fur traders so well. There was even a Bedford County rifle from Pennsylvania. Dan's rifle was a faithful reproduction of the classic Golden Era long rifle of the 1790 to 1810 period with a curly maple stock. He had to fill the powder measure by feel, using his thumb to determine when the measure was full to the brim. The .45 caliber ball was placed onto the greased patch, and he rammed the ball down with the hickory rod. A horizontal row of gun muzzles pointed down range as each shooter finished loading and took his stance. Each shot in turn at the glowing candles. Dan brought the rifle to his shoulder and held his cheek just behind the lock, sighting down the dark barrel. The candle appeared as a small glowing ball of light bisected by the swimming movement of the front sight as he tried to zero in on the tip of the flame. His right index finger touched the set trigger. Flint struck the steel frizzen in a small shower of sparks that set off the priming. the rifle chucked into his shoulder as the main charge went off with a long orange arc of flame that spit out of the bore with a drifting cloud of white smoke. The small glowing ball disappeared as the spinning bullet passed directly over the flame and snuffed the candle. "Good shot!" exclaimed several in the crowd. He was among 3 who snuffed a candle. The 3 moved back 10 paces to the second rag, swabbed their bores, and reloaded. The candles were relit and the crowd stood back at a respectful distance, keeping silent for the benefit of the shooters. Besides Dan's Golden Era long rifle, there was a poor boy and a Hawken left in the match. His was the only flintlock which could be a liability when compared to a caplock, since a flintlock could potentially hang fire. A hang fire happened when a flintlock set off the priming and failed to set off the main charge immediately, causing it to hang fire. The time it took for a hang fire to set off the main charge often caused the shooter to flinch and miss his mark. A caplock, however, never hung fire. The Hawken shot first and missed. The poor boy shot next, and the flame flickered but remained lit. Dan tapped the horn into the pan, primed it, shut the frizzen, ran his thumb across the flint to test its sharpness, and raised the rifle to his shoulder. If he missed, they would shoot again. He squinted down the top of the octagonal barrel and lined the sights up as he had before, knowing that the longer he held up the rifle, the greater his chance of a miss. He put the front sight on the tip of the flame and pulled the trigger. The rifle cracked in the quiet field, and the white cloud rose above the tall grass. Dan lowered the rifle and saw only 2 glowing candles. 30 paces ahead of him, he had snuffed his candle and won the match. On the ground downrange, the smoldering remnants of patching material sent up thin lines of smoke that soon dissipated. Dan felt slaps on the back and shook hands all around. He headed over to Shorty's camp to claim his canned ham and $4.50. He accepted the offered styrofoam cup of liquor and sat in the seat of honor beneath the light of the fading lantern. The novelty of the event had set off a chain reaction of animated stories and recollections among Shorty and the rest of the older crowd. As the stories continued into the night, Dan's eyes darted across the smoky table from one weathered face to another. He listened intently, soaking up as much as he could while it lasted, knowing that one day they would all be gone, and he would be one of the old-timers with a tale to tell. Perhaps he would tell of the time he snuffed 2 candles on a dark night, ate wild locusts and poached rabbit, and had a drink with some old friends.